Good afternoon. Welcome to the Legatum Institute. I am Anne Applebaum, and I am the director of the program on global transitions here. I'm welcoming both you, our London audience, and also a live stream audience. So welcome to everybody out there on the web. Those here, if you have cell phones, could you switch them off? Because apparently it makes it difficult for people listening from other places to hear. I'm really delighted to be, what I'm really here doing today is introducing and promoting a new paper written by Peter Pomerantsev. We've written it, he's written it and commissioned it. The two sponsors of the paper are Legatum and the Institute for Modern Russia. I'll introduce the head of the Institute for Modern Russia in a second, Pavel Khodorkovsky. But first I want to say, the purpose of the paper really was to frame some issues that we all talk about very often. There's a lot of conversation now about Russia. What should we do about Russia? Russia over there, it's a problem. How do we think about Russia? What I think Peter has tried to do is flip the conversation around and show us, first of all, explain what is modern Russia and why is it so hard for us to talk about it and understand what's different about it from not just Russia of 20 years ago, and of course Russia from 30 or 40 years ago, but also how what's happening in Russia affects us here. So many of the, many of the problems, many of the difficulties of contemporary Russia are really our problems, and by our I mean we here in London, here in Mayfair. The problems that he describes in his paper are local to this place. As I said, the paper was commissioned together by us and also by the Institute for Modern Russia. The president of the Institute for Modern Russia is now going to say a few words. He is Pavel Khodorkovsky. He founded the Institute to perpetuate the work of his father's Open Russia Forum. It's an organization that promotes civil society, rule of law, and inshallah, in the long term, democracy in Russia. Pavel, thanks for coming. So you first.
Thank you, Anne. I wanted to first express my appreciation for being able to be here today. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Jeff. And of course, thank you, Peter, for the wonderful work that you have produced. When the opportunity first came about for the Legatum Institute and my organization, the Institute of Modern Russia, to work together on this project, it sort of felt natural because we share a similar vision of open, educated, democratic, and a free market Russia. And I think we both have a clear-eyed understanding of the challenges and the steps, the challenges that exist today and the steps that need to be taken for the new and improved version of the modern Russia to finally come about. So it's an honor to join you today here. And more to join the platform with Anne, because Anne, you were probably among the first and the most vocal and best writers working in the Western world to identify this new direction that Russia was moving in back in the day. I'm viewing it through the prism of my father's imprisonment and your work on the, infamous now word after all the past 10 years of penitentiary system abuse. Your work on Gulag and its history has really been paramount to understanding the sort of reversal that we're now unfortunately going through today back home. As you probably know, my father has been in jail since 2003. I haven't seen him. I haven't had an opportunity to be with him and go back to Russia for the past 10 years. And while he has been trapped in what Amnesty International has called the judicial vortex, Russia has also been changing for the worse. As you know, NGOs are facing an intensified crackdown, and lawful, peaceful protesters face detention and trial simply for peacefully expressing their views and gathering for authorized protests in the streets of major Russian towns. Yesterday, as you may know, also in a chilling echo of Soviet times, one of the protesters, Mikhail Kosenko, was sentenced to forced psychiatric treatment. And I urge you to pay attention to his story, because if that situation does not get resolved in a couple of months, he may face severe medical repercussions of being detained in a psychiatric center. But also many different talented economists, managers, and intellectuals continue to flee the country in response to these changes in the climate, climate of corruption, economic stagnation, and authoritarianism. Freedom House said that repression in Russia is worse than at any time since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Amnesty International, which declared my father a prisoner of conscience, said that the space for freedom of assembly, association, and expression is rapidly shrinking in Russia. And I just want to share some more facts about the present state of the country. In the past 5 years, roughly $350 billion in capital has fled Russia. That's approximately a third of our country's GDP. And according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 25 journalists have been murdered in Russia since the year 2000. The most famous of whom, of course, is Janna, but there were many, many others. Hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs have been imprisoned in the past decade, and that's according to Russia's ombudsman for business rights. Russia is near the bottom of Transparency International Public Perception of Corruption Index. We're in very good company of other nations which don't lend their credibility to the sort of image that Russia wants to project internationally. And 2 years ago, the European Court of Human Rights found 180 cases of inhuman or degrading treatment, and a third of which happened in Russia. So we're really trying to lead the pack on all sorts of fronts that are shameful for a country that's trying to portray itself as a supernation. I should also say that the climate for human rights in Russia is extremely frosty, which is unfortunate, because I wish we could say the same about Sochi, Putin's favorite subtropical resort that is now going to be hosting the Winter Olympics. But what can we really expect from Sochi Games besides the corruption contracts that have been bountiful and the fake snow that unfortunately will have to be made because it's a subtropical resort? Well, we can expect to see the world leaders really shaking hands and pressing flesh with Putin, while joking about how great the resort is and how impressive his judo moves are. And I think it's legitimate to ask today if it's good enough. Also, I think it's legitimate to say that it's not. It's really not okay. People in Russia die for their beliefs and their principles, for their integrity, like the late lawyer and whistleblower Sergei Magnitsky. He was killed for exposing a fraud by state officials, and those state officials were never brought to justice. As we know, the funds that those state officials managed to appropriate have been funneled through many different countries in Europe. So it's not a far-removed problem that's unique to Russia. This is a problem that the entire Europe and as far back as the United States share. We're in this community of countries that really need to address this. Another unfortunate example that I have to give you is the story of Vasily Aleksanyan, a legal counsel for UCOS, who was detained in hopes of getting incriminating evidence against my father, and who has, as a result of being denied medical treatment, died very soon after he was finally released from jail. So those were lives of people that have been extinguished because of this new direction that the country has taken. These are the facts, and yet they're minimized, glossed over, and repackaged by this regime. It coats itself and its institution in the veneer of democratic legitimacy. And there are many around the world who continue to buy into this image. Peter's paper chips away at this gloss. to expose a state in which the language of institutions and democracy are not a sign of society moving forwards, but rather a mask for a society that's actually moving backwards. My father's case was an early warning sign of that reality, and as he has faced 10 years of imprisonment and 2 very absurd trials, it made clear that justice in Russia is nothing more than a charade. My father himself, addressing the Russian Supreme Court during an appeal hearing last August, which unfortunately failed, but at least has brought his release date 2 months closer, told the judges, ordinary people are talking about an absence of trust in the judiciary, and serious scholars about the breakdown of law. So, despite all of these circumstances, my father has remained committed to the vision of country as a sovereign, constitutional, democratic state that shares fundamental European values, human rights, and freedom, and it is based on a strong civil society. And I quote from him, as I had very limited opportunity to actually hear these words spoken to me in a private conversation. So I have to resort to what he said in public forum. He took a risk. People told him to flee Russia. I, of course, oftentimes over the past 10 years wished that he did. But he chose to put his face in the democratic institutions and in the judiciary system, and unfortunately he has paid the price. Today, his case has become one of the first few that have sort of cracked open this very lucrative opportunity to use the judiciary system as means for achieving goals, both by the state and businesses that are trying to gain an upper leg on their competition. But today, the Legatum Institute and the Institute of Modern Russia are looking behind this charade and this abuse, and I'm delighted to hand you over to Anne Applebaum and Peter Pomerantsev to continue the discussion about the work that Peter has done.
Thanks. Right. Right, so the format now is I'm going to throw Peter a few questions that will allow him to talk a little bit about the work, the research and the writing that he's done for the paper. And then I'm going to open it up to the floor. I know that many of you know a great deal about Russia, and it will be interesting to hear what you have to ask Peter. The title of the paper is Russia, a Postmodern Dictatorship. Peter, why postmodern? What do you mean by that? Can you describe it?
Sure. I mean, clearly after Pavel's very powerful speech, it's obviously some sort of dictatorship. However, it's an odd one because you've described this reality of Russia, but for an alien landing in Moscow, he wouldn't actually see any of this. He would actually see something that looks very, very Western, that feels very Western, with Starbucks everywhere, with this sort of hipster youth, with an opposition media that's very, very vocal, in much ways much more vocal than what we have here, with political parties debating on television about the future of the country. So even though, without a doubt, what Pavel has described as the reality, the sense and the experience of engaging with Russia is quite different. So when I say a postmodern dictatorship, if in the good old days of the 20th century you had a classic or hard kind of dictatorship which believed in things, had narratives, and then used them to sort of crush any kind of opposition, now this is kind of a shape-shifting kind of dictatorship which can use any language out there for its immediate aim. So it can be a liberal in the morning, a religious fanatic in the afternoon, whatever it needs to get somewhere. And we kind of fall for it in the West a lot of the time. Still, we talk about Russia as a country in transition. We talk about it as a hybrid democracy with authoritarian elements. And it really is none of these. It's an entirely new thing which has an entirely sort of dictatorial core, but which uses the language and the narratives and the games of democracy for undemocratic aims. Now, I'll give a small example. I lived for 9 years in Moscow, first as a political consultant, and then I worked in media. And one of the projects that I worked on was something called Snob Media. It was set up by Mikhail Prokhorov in 2008. Mikhail Prokhorov at that time was Russia's richest, sexiest, tallest, kind of super-duper intellectual oligarch man. And he created really this beautiful oasis for the liberal intelligentsia. In this beautiful reconstructed warehouse, all the, not just the cities, the countries, sort of top Western journalists were gathered to create a new kind of Russian identity. It was called a global Russian. And we would be the new opposition to the Kremlin. The editor was Masha Gessen, the deputy editor was Masha Gessen, who's, you know, a warrior against the Kremlin in many ways. And we were encouraged to be liberal, to be outspoken, to criticize as much as possible. At the same time, we all understood that there's no way that this project was happening without the Kremlin's kind of permission. And what the Kremlin was doing was something very, very clever. Instead of crushing the opposition and crushing dissidents and throwing them in jail, it was largely giving them a paycheck, making them feel as if they have a tribune to say their opinions, while framing them in a way that was very, very clever. Because by calling it snob, by calling it, by having it sort of promote both liberal politics, but also sort of a wealthy Western lifestyle, it immediately alienated it from sort of the common Russian. And soon enough, in 2012, Mikhail Prokhorov, who's a good guy, became the liberal candidate at the presidential elections. He acted as a sponge. He got 8%. People voted for him to give liberals a sense there was someone to vote for. At the same time, he's the perfect foil for Putin, because Putin gets to say, look, I'm fighting these westernized, corruptish oligarchs all over again. So he's the perfect kind of puppet opposition. So it's a completely new kind of game. I think it's sort of summed up in a topographical image. So the hub of the Russian opposition, the new Russian opposition, it's on an island right opposite the Kremlin. And here there is a Rem Koolhaas, together with Alexander Mamut, the funder of Waterstones, has set up an incredibly sort of avant-garde architecture school. Right next to it, there's a TV station, Telekanal Dozhd, which sort of transmits these sort of very liberal, very kind of like very sort of vaguely sort of pro-Western kind of lifestyle onto the world. There are some bars and cafes there as well. And this is just where the Kremlin is very happy to have the opposition, on an island, right opposite the Kremlin, where it can flatten it literally at any point, because it's housed in an old factory which literally could be flattened at any moment, and obviously funded by oligarchs who are, at the end of the day, very, very, very tame. So they've done something very, very clever. They've taken opposition and they've used it to make them stronger. So that's just a little image of what I mean by sort of a postmodern dictatorship.
In your paper, you talk quite a bit about, to my mind, in some new ways, about the emerging opposition to this strange, as you say, shape-shifting, constantly transforming system, which tries to absorb opposition into its own narrative. Can you talk a little bit about the nature of the new opposition? How can it argue against this system of what is an all-encompassing system? How do you make an argument against this? And who are the new opposition?
So let's not talk, obviously, let's move away from Navalny and Khodorkovsky, because that's kind of who everybody knows. So there's somebody who I looked at in the paper. Her name is Janna Jakob. She was everything that sort of Westerns wanted to see in new Russia, kind of wanted out of Russia. Her parents were academics. Her dad was a chemistry professor. She had her own business, which grew in the 90s, and by the mid-2000s was actually doing very, very well indeed. She imported chemical cleaning agents from France and then resold them to factories, army bases. So one of these sort of like self-starting, small to medium businesses that kind of the World Bank would write tomes on, saying this is what Russia needed. So one morning she wakes up and she's arrested, basically. And she's taken to the DEA office. She was arrested by the Drugs Enforcement Agency. And they said, you are a criminal. And she's like, what have I done? I've even been paying my taxes. Even though she was thinking, yeah, it's a tax thing. They want to catch me on some taxes. I'll give a bribe. I'll walk away. And they're like, no, this is far more serious. You are a drugs dealer. And she's like, what do you mean I'm a drugs dealer? And they're like, yeah, this cleaning agent you've been buying from France, it's now re-registered as a narcotic. And overnight, based the DEA, in an attempt to kind of sort of co-opt a lot of and take over a lot of the companies that worked in the pharmaceuticals and chemicals industries, they're taking a lot of chemicals, which have been legal yesterday, and made them illegal. And we're arresting people in order to break them, take away their businesses, and so on. And Janna Yakovleva was flung into prison. The first thing they said, look, we'll do a deal with you. Give us part of your company, and you can survive. And she refused to do that. And when she was explaining it to me, she wasn't even talking about the finance. She was like, that would let them define what reality is. If I say that I am guilty, then they can say black is white and white is black, which I think we very much saw in the trial with Khodorkovsky, where the very point of the trial, the very point of the accusations were their absurdity. Yesterday, somebody was found guilty of protesting, of violent protest, when the policeman who arrested him said, but I didn't see him do anything. This is absolutely ridiculous. And the whole point is to make the whole of society kind of swallow the Kremlin's version. The Kremlin controls the script, and all its underlings control the script. And Yakovleva was like, I'm not going to sign it, because if I do that, it's almost like I've given away a bit of myself. And that psychological battle came first. Then she started to think, okay, so they want to take over my company. So this is about corruption. How do I fight back against corruption? And so she started, with the help of some human rights groups, to protest on the streets of Moscow. But you can protest all you like against corruption in Russia, nothing will ever change. And then she started to work out the bigger picture of what was going on. So the head of the DEA was Viktor Cherkesov. Viktor Cherkesov was an old buddy of Putin's from St. Petersburg KGB days. He'd actually been in charge of the 5th department of the KGB in St. Petersburg in the 1970s, so it was his job to arrest dissidents. And as Putin rose, he became deputy head of the FSB. And then Putin gave him the DEA as his kind of patrimony that he could make money off and kind of look after. But Cherkesov's ambitions were much bigger, it turned out, than just taking away Yakovleva's company or the pharmaceutical industry. He wanted to really be the power behind the throne. He wanted to be head of the FSB, or even more than that. And he was in a clan war with the head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, another former KGB guy. So there was this clan war going on behind the scenes, increasingly in front of the scenes, because the DEA were trying to bust the FSB doing corrupt deals, while the FSB would do busts on the DEA doing corrupt deals. And the only way that Yakovleva, in the end, won her battle was by getting involved in this clan battle. And basically, very bizarrely, the FSB helped her by not getting in the way of her protests, by giving her as much media exposure as possible, because it made Cherkesov look bad. Hope you're following all these names. So the only way to actually play against the system was A, psychologically not give in to its rules, B, fight the corruption, but C, you have to start playing the different clans off each other, because that's the weak point of the system. Which brings me to the protesters. I mean, the new protest movement in Russia, it's first and foremost a psychological movement. It's actually this bizarre existential search that's happening in Russia for a different type of individual, a different type of attitude towards yourself. You can use the word integrity, but it's about people who don't want to have reality defined to them. The second aspect that's going on is a lot of them small businessmen. I spent time with the volunteers for Navalny's campaign over the course of the election, the Moscow election a few weeks ago. And what was fascinating was a lot of them were science educated. A lot of them had small IT businesses. So this really is a sort of, we talk about an emergent middle class, the first time I actually saw it in Russia. But
so not Moscow intellectuals?
No, not necessarily. No, not at all. Actually, the Moscow intellectuals are very sort of louche about the whole movement. It's actually much more. I was very reminded of Weber's idea of a Protestant work ethic. These were people, largely science grads, people who had their own small businesses, who wanted to call a spade, who didn't want to be involved in this endless game playing anymore, because both their kind of sort of psychological and their education kind of like pushed away from that. No, I called it the revolution of the nerds. This was largely people from sort of sciencey backgrounds. But, and I think this is the final thing, is in order to play this system, you have to play the game of Kremlin factions. I don't think it's ever going to be enough to just have a protest movement. You have to play politics. And that's kind of the third thing that happens with this new protests.
What is the role of the West, both, or let's put it differently, what does the opposition want from the West, and what does the Kremlin want from the West? How do they see us? What is our role in the new Russia?
you used to go to Russia, and they used to hold up A, the West as an ideal, and B, there was like, you must help us in the West. And now you hear a completely different type of discourse from the new Russian opposition. They're like, the West is the problem. Because and they actually talk about London mainly, they're not even talking about America so much, they're talking mainly about England. They're like, by making London such a how shall I say, such a free and easy global capital, it's become the place where the Kremlin elites can solidify and legitimize their money. So the West is now seen increasingly as the problem rather than solution, which completely sort of changes the dialogue. I mean, I talked to Navalny's deputy, Jakob, and he was like, I've talked to the FSA on many occasions. We've given them big fat files about how state Russian banks, like the VTB or other state Russian companies, used London as a money laundering centre, and there's just no reaction. It's as if I'm just like throwing stuff into the water. And he was very polite. He was like, well, I guess, you know, they're very underfunded and all this stuff, but it's clearly a question of political will. And of course, we all know it is. We all know that there's an innate contradiction between Britain being a global hub and Britain doing other things which get in the way of that. I mean, I had a very powerful conversation with Vasily Aleksanyan, who is former deputy head of the central bank. So not a lefty in any way. This is a neoliberal, you know, somebody who's right-wing in his sort of economic opinions. And he was screaming at me down the phone. He was saying, like, as long as you don't start regulating Russian companies in London, you might as well shut up about democracy and human rights. And I was like, but what's the connection? Hold on, these are different dialogues. When Cameron meets with Putin, he has one dialogue about economics. He goes, hey, we have 700 million new contracts in Russia. And then he has another dialogue about human rights where he says something and Putin goes, and that's it. So what we've kind of done, and this is something that thing is very post-Cold War, is we've separated out the human rights, the political dialogue, and the economic dialogue.
Because we think they're different.
Because it's convenient, for many reasons, I think, yes. We think they're different. Also, it's sort of, it's not to our advantage necessarily to lift the other one.
But do they look different from the Russian point of view?
Yeah, for them, they see, I mean, they're basically sort of in the smithy of democratic capitalism at the moment, where they really see an integral connection between financial corruption, political rights, and human rights. For them, it's one thing. For
the opposition?
Well, yeah, thus the sort of the slogan that Navalny had for his election was "Don't lie, don't steal," which has this religious sort of underpinning to it, this sort of very strong moral thing, which is about finance, don't steal, and also about some kind of psychological integrity, don't lie. He kind of managed to bring all these themes into one bundle. I mean, the irony is that during the Cold War, there was a point where human rights and politics and economics all came together. Sort of the rhetoric that one used against the Soviet Union was sort of this wonderful mixture of, we will defeat you with the combination of Jackson Pollock, Amnesty International, and Morgan Stanley. And they were all like one thing that we kind of threw at the Soviet Union. And it didn't have an answer. And now they've kind of taken that, they've recut and pasted and thrown it back in our faces, and they're winning.
And they do contemporary art, they do investment banking.
Yeah. You know,
and they have human rights rhetoric.
Sure, VTB, which is sort of almost a model money laundering organization, is one of the most generous sponsors of some of the most radical and clever modern arts projects in Russia and abroad.
And so then this is maybe something Pavel wants to talk about as well. So what do we do about that, we here in London?
The question really is, how do we link the 2 points? How do you think it's possible to link up the human rights principles and the very practical matters of securing trade contracts, reaching very pragmatic, diplomatic accords? For example, as you know, there is a huge issue with the Greenpeace activists being detained and facing as much as 15 years of imprisonment in Russia. In this particular case, of course, Russia is very happy to keep the two questions separate. The question of normal diplomatic relations and the question of human rights and the rule of law. Like, of course, well, let's keep this aside, we'll proceed as needed, and we won't pay any attention. So how do we, in practicality, how do you think it's possible to link the two?
Well, don't depend too much on governments, firstly, but secondly, I think that we have to start reframing the conversation about Russia. We still think of Russia as like that country over there, how do we build our dialogue with it? What's becoming increasingly apparent is that what we should be talking about is our own financial system, international corruption, and how we deal with that. And Russia will then actually become a subtext of that. I think we have to stop looking of Russia as this other that we can build different types of relationships with and start internalizing it into a debate we're having about Mayfair.
You spoke about the different clan wars and having access to that information as practically the only opportunity to actually win in protecting your own rights and protecting your business in Russia. So would it be actually possible to use a structure such as FSA to actually persuade them and provide the information about the corrupt money flows, about the different deals and the financing scenarios for the different clans that are being exposed as the nature of them actually trying to do business outside of Russia?
Well, that's actually the FSA's job. I mean, that's what should be happening. This really is, we're back to the 1970s where there was this slogan, keep your own laws. These laws are actually all there. The FSA in turn writes reports about banks which should be regulating themselves but are always sort of closing their eyes on what money is coming in. And the banks then write reports about the London Stock Exchange, which has this wonderful secondary market which lists all these slightly shady and very shady companies, and saying how they should regulate themselves. So these laws are actually there. It really is a case of them being enacted. So how do we get themselves enacted? I mean, my sort of ideal vision, which is completely sort of unrealistic probably, is sort of the civil society and media, much as they did in the 70s and 80s, having this huge impact in human rights, now having a similar sort of impact in corruption. So at the moment for this paper, I talked to a very large anti-corruption NGO in London, and I was like, well, you must do a lot of work with Russia. They're like, nah, we don't know anyone there. And I'm like, what about Navalny? He's like, he's a bit political. And like, so, how do you do Russia? Like, well, we kind of ignore Russia. I'm like, but that's the main source of corruption. Or one of the main sources of corruption coming into London. Like, yeah, I know, it's a bit silly, isn't it? It has some competitors, yeah. It has some, no, exactly, and that's the way we should be talking about it. We should be talking about Russia, Nigeria, Madoff. They're actually part of one discussion now. So there has to be a different level of coordination between what is thought of as anti-corruption NGOs in different countries, and they need to have a different level of coordination with media through to sort of sponsoring and paying for sort of media research, because virtually no magazine or newspaper can afford to sort of invest time in these sort of long research projects that you would need.
Would you think it is possible in the long run to actually engage the British business community? Because as much as I could tell, the part of the reason to why Navalny's narrative was so popular abroad is because ultimately his, let's call it, historical win would lead to actually an opportunity to do more and much more transparent business with Russia. So do you think this idea of actually helping themselves, British companies looking to do more business with Russia, insisting on drawing this link, is it possible to sell this idea here in the UK?
Well, that's terribly long-term, Pavel. You're talking about a process of sort of 10, 20 years, and everyone's, as people in the business community have to, they have to make profits far quicker than that. So I'm afraid actually not rocking the boat and looking, every British businessman is always looking for a krisha in Russia, like who's the roof, it excites them far more than the idea of promoting Navalny. There is, however, a different discussion to be had about London especially, because whenever I talk to people in the financial industry here about why are we so lax about letting all this money into Britain, which is of dubious kind of positive consequence to a lot of Britain, because it's sort of hot money, doesn't really go into British industry, no one's really sure what it's doing. They always say, well, they'll go to Singapore, but then they'll leave us and they'll go to Singapore and be all alone. And there's this incredible paranoia in London that if we're more strict with our rules, all this wonderful Gunvor money will disappear to Singapore. And I think that is very much a test of sort of British kind of self-respect and resolve. I think there's a very strong case to be made of the more kind of the more of a closed club and the higher standards they have, actually the long-term financial benefits, which will be much bigger. But that's kind of the argument that needs to start, because we're not really having that argument at the moment.
But Russia ultimately wants to be part of Europe, not necessarily part of Asia. And I think with so many years now under the belt of the Russian elite, having spent their time and invested their money in England, unraveling this would be very difficult. So I don't know, maybe it's a little bit more midterm than 10, 20 years.
Well, William Browder would argue that what we should be doing is using the people who are here and making sure that they know they need to abide by our financial laws and our criminal laws, indeed, and making sure that people who have money invested here are obeying our laws. Do you think it's that simple?
Yes. It is about, the laws are all out there. This is not some sort of bit of legal genius that needs to be invented. It is actually about enacting the principles that are out there. And also, Russia itself, I think, is at a moment why Putin's own anti-corruption drive is so potentially interesting. It's a little bit like the moment in the sort of during the Carter administration when the Soviet Union signed up to various human rights pledges. Russia has signed up to all these anti-corruption, international anti-corruption pledges. So it really is up to NGOs, just like in the 70s and 80s, they play the human rights card very well, to now play the anti-corruption card very well. It's like, hold on, but you've signed up to this, you're joining the OECD, which is going to happen very soon, Russia joining the OECD, had to sign up to a whole bunch of anti-corruption, anti-bribery rhetoric, and it's really up to a whole new sector to kind of really push that into the Kremlin's face now. But how about your minister? He's got this sort of shadow over here, and so on and so forth.
Let me take a few questions from the audience. If you could introduce yourselves and say who you are before speaking. Let's do one in the back and then you, sir.
Hello, my name is Vadim Nikitsin.
Could you stand up so we can hear?
Hi, my name is Vadim Nikitsin. I work in business intelligence, but I do some writing about Russia in my spare time. I just wanted to say thank you, Peter, for raising many great points. And something you said about the link between kind of human rights, commercial freedoms, made me think. I wanted to ask you, do you think there's a danger of us conflating human rights and commercial rights when we talk about Russia? Because let's face it, I mean, the things that we're talking about, the Khodorkovsky issue, these small businessmen who are tech startups and stuff, this is about people asking for commercial freedoms. We have intellectual freedoms already in Russia to a great extent. You talked about Tevye, etc. So what we see is do you think that this resembles more of a civil war where two cliques are competing for freedoms to make money, and we are staking ourselves on one of those cliques who seem to be nicer, but neither of them are very representative of Russia? What makes you think that this particular clique, these nerds, these small businessmen, these enlightened opposition, would be any better custodians of the country than the other clique that represents big state businesses?
Okay, you know what? I'm going to take a couple of questions and/or comments to start with. The gentleman right here, and then in the back.
Robert Jackson. I used to be a member of Parliament. A rather cynical observation. It seems to me that there's very little capacity for Britain to intervene directly in Russian internal affairs, or for people based in Britain to do that. On the other hand, one of the great weaknesses of Russia, surely, is the export of capital, huge figure given by Mr. Khodorkovsky, and the export of good people. And Britain seems to be quite an important factor in that export. Perhaps we are contributing to the damaging of this regime simply in a negative way by making it easy for people to come here.
Right, and one final in the back, and then you can respond.
Ben Judah, I'm a journalist. Can you tell us a bit about the new Russian criminal elite that's coming to London? What are these people like? What do they think about Britain? How are the British elites relating to them? Can you sort of unpack that psychology for us a bit?
Criminal leaders, did you say?
Criminal elites.
Okay.
Elites or criminal elites? Whatever.
Who did you have in mind? This conversation could like.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about kind of can you just tell us a bit about these kind of wealthy Russians with dubious money that are kind of coming to London? What do they think about Britain? How are they relating to Britain? How do the British people relate to them?
Sure.
Three questions. three questions. Choose which one if you'd like to answer.
They're all really good. I kind of love. I think it's almost a separate question about how the British are relating to them, because I find that absolutely fascinating. It's a little bit out of the framework of this conversation. So, Mr. Jackson, so your point was that actually we are making it worse by sucking Russia dry and taking all its best brains. That's actually something that you actually hear quite a lot from both people in Russia. They say, is this a strategy? Are you trying to suck Russia dry? Is this what you're trying to do?
Not a strategy, but it may work.
Yeah. And the other one I hear is from sort of once you've had a few drinks near Parliament, people go, well, hey, think about it, it's kind of working. We're getting richer, they're getting poorer, and they're giving us their best people. Firstly, funnily enough, actually, it actually relates exactly to Ben's question, because if before people used to come to Britain and want to be British, simply because Britain was top dog, and so they changed their surnames from the Mironovs would become the Helen Mirrens, and the Vinogradovs would become the Michael Grades. That isn't how Britain is seen anymore. Britain is seen as a place where convenient for a bit of onshore, offshore finance. You send your kids to an English school, not because you want them to be English or give anything to the English economy, simply because it's kind of a badge. You go to Courchevel, have your kid at Stowe, usually, Wellington increasingly. It's just a thing you do. They're not looking to integrate, and this is not like, the old thing about let's get the Jews here from Spain, where they've just been thrown out of, because they will bring their knowledge and they'll bring their money. The most of the Russian elites coming in with the big money are not going to invest it into Britain. They're investing into housing, and then they'll move it on, and then they'll move it on again. So it's kind of a everybody loses game rather than sort of everybody wins game. So that's what I'd say about that. Also, you have to be.
They're not buying coats of arms like America.
Yeah, they're not.
used to do.
Well, yeah, they don't need to. Why would they? So that I think I'm not sure that money is actually sort of like coming in and taking root here and doing something good here.
Who's leaving Russia?
Actually, a lot of it then goes back. This is the funny thing, because obviously this famous anecdote that Cyprus is the biggest foreign investor in Russia. No, they take it out of Russia, they make it kind of safe, and then a lot of the time they bring it back. A lot of the Russians that you see here, they've put their wives and kids here. Their business is still there. London is like a sort of a getaway place before you then move on to somewhere else. So it's a weird capital flight. Most of the capital actually then kind of it leaves, as Pavel says. Then it kind of goes by, but can make sure it can leave again whenever necessary. But it is about having a bigger narrative. I think Pavel is quite right. If Russia was flourishing, then we could invest more. We'd all be richer. It's these old kind of Milton Friedman arguments about why a good, healthy kind of capitalist economy is good for everyone. So about that, about the connection between human rights and commercial rights. One of the most stunning things that was said to me as I researched this paper, and it was actually said by Ben Judah, who's in this room, so I can't take claim to this. He's like, isn't it time to say that anti-corruption is a human right? Do we need to start reframing the whole conversation about corruption? Because we still talk about it as if it's bungs. We still talk about it as like, here's a little bit under here, here's a little bit under here. And I remember one banker telling me, it's not corruption, it's the free market, which is a fairly good argument. I think what's clear with the Russian opposition is that human rights, psychological integrity, and corruption are one thing, and so is a fair political system. So do we need to actually strengthen the way we conflate financial issues and human rights issues? So yeah.
Another question. Right, one from this side in order to be fair, and then maybe right there. So.
Thank you very, very much indeed, everyone. My name is Ewan Grant. Since leaving Customs and Excise, where I was the intelligence analyst for transnational organised crime in the ex-Soviet countries, most of my work has been with law enforcement agencies in several ex-Soviet countries, although not Russia itself. My question is particularly following from the point about what can the NGOs do, the Western NGOs. Is there a problem that, quite frankly, a lot of the very good work NGOs like Global Witness are doing on, for instance, the Nigerian banks and Nigerian oil and Congo and DR Congo and the like, is that they're not really comfortable, and I think this particularly applies to international law enforcement organizations like the UN. They're not really comfortable dealing with policemen, and even less so with soldiers. And so therefore they're not ideally suited to take on a society, semi-militarized, semi-police state of the ex-Soviet states. And maybe there's an opportunity for the media helping them and encouraging them to bring in a few policemen, but also maybe a few soldiers, but to just think that the countries they do very good work on, such as Nigeria and the like, these are countries with economies which often have very considerable similarities. Oil, gold, diamonds, like commodities, like mines, but add in the element about the where have all the soldiers, where have all the airmen, particularly the air transport fleets, and where have all the merchant and naval crewmen all gone?
Right, another, we'll do you as you're close, and then, sorry, one and then two, and then I'll go backwards next time.
Tessa Shishkovits, I'm an Austrian journalist here, former Russia correspondent. I was wondering, if you look at the case of Nadia Tolokonikova, who went on hunger strike in prison, and then she, after 9 days, she stopped. And now the prison authorities say, like, oh, really, you work 16 hours and you only get, like, well, I don't know, 10 kopecks per month. We will look into this, and the laws will get a little bit better, and the conditions will get a little bit better. And I was wondering, what do you think, what that tells us? Civil courage pays, or fig-leafing works on the side of the officials? And I wanted to ask you, Pavel, your father might be released next summer. Do you think he will join the new opposition? Because he's certainly someone that people see as a moral conscience of this of Russia now, but also in the light of the young middle class opposition that is now 30 years, 20 years younger, and has a completely different outlook on the world, maybe or maybe not. Do you think he will join, or will he refrain?
Well, let's have one more, you, sir, and then you all can respond.
That last question is so interesting. My name is Dennis Corboy. I'm currently a research fellow at King's College. The dilemma that some of us are trying to struggle with is to find the balance where we are now faced with new possibilities. Now, I refer in the foreign policy and cooperation possibilities if the Syrian agreement is a success. And if signals that some of us are picking up are correct, this could open other areas of cooperation where there are common interests. And I refer to where we need Russia is a major player, and we need to be able to work with Russia on Iran, on the Middle East, on North Korea. And we all have a common interest in the security of the Sochi Games. So there are many things where if this opening is a real opening, we then must find the balance that we take advantage and build on this, but don't undermine what are our values and our standards, and what must continue to be our support for those who are struggling within Russia. Even though nobody listens to us, our NGOs are shut down, we can't really give up on these values and these principles. Where is this balance? And this is, I think, the dilemma some of us are trying to puzzle with.
Thank you. Do you two want to respond? Maybe yes, Pavel goes first. Yeah.
Well, let me address the question from Tessa about the joining the opposition and the release. So currently my father is scheduled to be released in August of next year, August 2014. I fully expect the Russian government to actually this time not intervene and allow my father to walk free next year. As to his plans after his release, of course it's up to him. I have very little specific knowledge as to what he intends to do other than first recuperate after 10 years of imprisonment and spend as much time as he can with his family. But to link up with the other comment about the average age of these people that have been participating over the course of the last 2 years in the public protest, you know, these 20, 30-year-old members of the Russian society, I think have a different idea for what the opposition should look like. I think one of the main problems, really, in the Russian politics is the fact that the Russian society continuously tries to find this individual leader. And we constantly, throughout the course of our history, end up with this paternalistic single individual. Sometimes it's a good one, sometimes more often it's a bad one. But I think this really needs to be changed. So I think for our country to advance, we need to have not only the plurality of political views and parties, but also a plurality of leaders. So in that sense, I think my father's importance as a moral leader for the opposition is probably much more valuable than his potential of becoming one of the leading figures that people can get behind. Because I think the only reasonable way for Russia to advance is to have this transitional period where multiple leaders and multiple parties will get the Russian society used to the fact that opposition and political pluralism is the norm, rather than constantly trying to serve this idea of finding and supporting this single man or woman.
Mm-hmm. Comments to any of those comments?
What about Nadia, the Pussy Riot girl? I think as I said, the protest movement in Russia, which is sort of ebbed and flowed in little sobs and gasps, a mistake that people made about it, they said, oh, it's going to be a new Arab Spring. And it wasn't a new Arab Spring. People were like, oh, well, that's not a story then. And journalists don't really write about it. It doesn't make front page. It might be in The Guardian. It's stuck on page 5, which is where I want it to be. I think that's a very good sign. I think Russia is now mature enough to have got over these revolutions. It really is, at the base of it, actually some sort of existential psychological search. That's why when you talk to the opposition, they sort of say financial corruption third. What they say right at the start is like some way of сохранить себя, that wonderful phrase that Berezovsky said about Khodorkovsky. Berezovsky was always the shapeshifter, always moving and playing and always recreating himself, while Khodorkovsky kind of remained himself and remained a person of some sort of integrity to himself and paid the price for it. So this idea of сохранить себя, of somehow to be oneself, preserve yourself, so preserve your integrity, because the psychological sort of fallout from this kind of world of endless shape-shifting and simulacra is your kind of self, and your idea of yourself starts to double and triple up. It's an old sort of Soviet problem, this idea of doublethink. You're one person at work, where you believe in communism, you simulate belief in communism. At home, you're someone completely different. So your self kind of sort of breaks up into these little bits. I think the most important thing about Navalny is that he gives a certain way of behaving which is utterly different to this kind of endless shape-shifting and imitation. So symbolic gestures, as you call them, are hugely important because they change the intellectual, and here I will be completely Russian and use the word spiritual climate of the country. So they're key. They're absolutely key. I don't think I've ever used the word spiritual before in English, and I never will again. In Russian, it kind of pops out. So it's absolutely key. So yeah, that's sort of the main thing I had to say about that. I'd love to see cops and spooks working together. I think that'd be great. That's the kind of thing we need. We need cops, spooks. We need like an A-team of anti-corruption with Luke Harding at the helm. It's going to be great.
A few other comments. I feel that I should move to the other side of the room now, but since we have two nice ladies here, one and then two.
Galina, I worked for Russian government and I was also a civil society leader in Russia. Now I'm UK government scholar. My question is about the West and if it's really interested in Russia. Before coming here 1 year ago, I thought that because UK government invested in me, they're kind of interested in Russia and interested in doing something with Russia. After spending a year here, I don't feel that Russia is on the agenda. I feel that Mexico, China, all the developing world and the agenda if you look at the FED project, they're all about Africa and Latin America. Russia is, nobody's, I mean, I feel that people are not interested here. They get the money from our oligarchs, and that's all. So this is concerning your thoughts about economic part and human rights part. I don't feel that they're really interested in doing something. What do you think?
One other, please. And then we'll take a third from the back.
Thanks so much. Nina Dos Santos, I'm an anchor at CNN. We haven't talked an awful lot about Putin as a person, as a postmodern, potentially dictator, depending on how you want to frame these discussions. He's now back in power after camping out as prime minister for a stint. Where are we headed here with Putin? Is he going to become perhaps a wounded beast who might become more desperate domestically? Russia's not making the same money on its oil and gas revenues as it once was. And the United States is going to be having its own gas. So where is all that heading? Thanks.
All right, thanks. Just as a comment, the paper isn't really about Putin himself, but anyway. And then there was one in the back.
Dan Munford, I run a research and publishing business. How much has the Afghan war prevented the West from taking a tougher line on Russia, and obviously led by US foreign policy, UK perhaps secondary to that?
Peter, response.
Pavel, do you want to say something about Putin?
So kicking the ball down the
road. No, I'm actually more interested in what Pavel thinks about it. I have nothing more. I'm a journalist, so I think I have the questions. I don't know the answer.
Sure, I can speak about the man. I think the main takeaway points that we have learned about Putin as a person over the course of the last, not even 13 years, I mean, I would say probably 15 years. The fact that he is loyal, he is smart, he has core set of rather conservative old values, and oftentimes he's unsure of the future. So what's happening right now is he has the same set of core principles that he's operating on in terms of both ruling the country and presenting his own public image. That for, let's be honest, for still a very large part of the Russian population works. Even though United Russia's approval ratings are plummeting, Putin's personal approval ratings are still quite high. And I think this is, one of the reasons to why virtually for the past 10 years, his personal image remains unchanged. It still works. It still works. But what doesn't work, as you mentioned, is the fact that the outside landscape keeps changing. Russia as a country obtained this very important geopolitical lever of influence by renationalizing oil and gas industry. It allowed them to do certain things that sort of forcefully thrust Russia back into the political arena as a leader, although the leader that, if given the opportunity, no one would really like to do business with in this industry, because shutting off gas is not the preferred way of negotiating a contract. But I think that Putin is really unsure of his future because he sees this landscape changing, and he doesn't know how to adapt himself. He relies on a group of people that share his principles, and that's why after the May protests of last year, we sort of turned to repression, because these are the methods that his supporters in the presidential administration and in various different ministries, they know how to play this game. They have been playing this game for many, many years before. They don't really know how to reinvent Russia. So that's why he's also using a lot of political technologies and really reinventing the way that the opposition could be used. And this is the point that Peter makes in his paper. But overall, for the country's direction, still, I think, in the long term wouldn't work, because with Germany adopting a completely new energy policy that will make it much less industrially subservient to the Russia's Gazprom whims, and many other countries following suit, especially after the discovery of shale gas in the United States and now in other countries in Poland. This sort of lever is trying to get, is basically taken away. So I think Putin as a man really needs to not only reinvent himself, but also come up with a new way of ruling Russia. And that means in modern day world, that means reforms. And I don't think that he's prepared to really take on this task.
Peter, did you want to respond or answer any of the other
points?
Yeah,
no, of course. Your point about do the English care. How long have you been in England?
For 1 year.
1 year. The English are really good at making out that they don't care. It's one of their masteries. Something what I call the spare room theory of kind of social change. Like, oh, you can come to this country, but stay in the spare room and don't come downstairs to breakfast. Funnily enough, I mean, there's 2 points. Firstly, do they care about Russia? This is kind of what I'm trying to say. Reframe the dialogue about Russia into a much bigger one about what kind of financial system do we want? And I think that clearly is something that really does affect people here. Papers are full of it.
So, Russia is now part of
Russia is now part of that.
British economy.
Russia is now sort of arching balletically back into relevance because it's so much part of the global financial system. So yes, I think one does, let's stop having the argument about Russia, let's start having the argument about how it fits into sort of financial system we want. But about the English not caring, I'm just finishing a book about modern Russia, and a whole chunk of it is about the Russians here and about the English reaction to them. And in numerous interviews, underneath the sort of veneer of not caring are a lot of fears, complexes, and self-hatred. So I'd be very careful about when the British act sang-froid. It's not true.
Okay. And a question from the back.
Good evening. My name is Tonya Samsonova. I'm a foreign correspondent from that small island in front of the Kremlin, which Peter mentioned. It's TV Rain channel. Mr. Khodorkovsky just mentioned that attitudes of Russian audience and Russian people coincides a lot with with the Putin's mindset, that conservative and rather, well, strict mindset, to be honest. Being a correspondent of a small liberal independent media, hipsters like, you always find very upsetting that you can work very hard, but you can't convince Russian people that gays are normal people, that it's good to be honest, it's good not to steal votes during the elections, etc., etc., etc. But suddenly, and actually a lot of Russian journalists are frustrated because they are influential at some point, but not enough, because they can't persuade the whole Russia, those Siberia districts and everything. What is in the head of those people? Who knows? Well, Putin claims and Kremlin claims that they knows what is in the head of those people, because they have these huge polling organizations, pollsters, who made the research. And actually state propaganda and people who work for state propaganda in Russia, they say, oh, we don't want to talk about gays on our TV channels because people don't like gays. And they base their judgments on what Russian people think on this, I would say, hugely misinterpreted public opinion results, which all of us know and which all of us trust, because we have no other data about what people from Siberia think and what they have in their head, instead of these figures, 30% for Putin, 40% for that guy and that guy. But actually, I just figured out, and I do a bit of investigation, just a small bit, and I figured out that we don't know anything about those people and about their attitudes. And the very funny, I would say, thing is, one of my friends, he works in a Russian school for teenagers, like they're 16 or 15 years old. It's an elite, very good Russian school, one of the best in Russia, like among 3 top schools. And their parents obviously are liberals and that kind of Western-oriented global Russians with the whole set of normal attitudes, I would say. And their people, their children in that school, they're anti-gay, hugely pro-Putin guys, children. And that's because of the propaganda. But you can't be very upset because of that, but because as those children so quickly absorbed those political attitudes gained from the last years of Putin era, they would as easily leave them away if the situation and the institutions would change. And there is a very good example. When IKEA, the store IKEA started in Russia, everybody were concerned that, oh, you know, Russian people, they would steal everything, and there are so many things around there. They would make a huge mess in the store. You can't launch a store where everything is displayed and you can try everything. It's not for Russia, it's for Great Britain or for some more better countries, but not for Russians. And, well, the head of the company said, well, you know, people are very good everywhere. If you set up the right institutional framework, they would behave themselves well. And it turned out that Russian people in IKEA, they destroyed, they were so accurate with the things inside that they destroyed like 10% less than in the other countries. So, because they were so happy that somebody trusted them with those things, they would try to just to show how good they are. We're really thankful. And I would say that it's really not true that maybe nowadays people in Russia support Putin and think that Putin is a cool guy. But if you switch Putin off and set another standards of values, that would very easy come the other way and become the other.
Yes. I've recently published a book about how propaganda was brought to Central Europe in 1945. And how these various countries were Sovietized. And it's very true that very quickly it did seem like everybody believed in the new system, only for it to be pretty clear weeks later, weeks after Stalin died, that they didn't at all. So always be careful what people tell you they think at any given moment. One other in the back.
I have 2 questions. One is a follow-up from the comments of the Russian reporter here. Is the Russian opposition kind of has separated itself from the normal Russia, the Russian in Siberia and other parts of Russia? And if so, why? And my second question, not to take the focus out of Russia, is Russia leading in creating a new model of postmodern dictatorships that we can see in other countries? I'm not trying to name any of them now, but you know, is this kind of, you have some elements of market economy and capitalism, but at the same time you don't have democracy. So does it mean Russia is creating a new model, the same as it did with the Soviet Union? Thank you.
Okay. One other, was there one over here? Yes. Especially interested in comments about Britain. But anyway, go ahead.
Andrew Wood. First of all, Chatham House. I hope that Pavel is right that his father will be released next year, given the rather vindictive nature of Vladimir Vladimirovich. One has to question it. And there were certainly people within the Russian organs who were trying to prepare something worse than that. But I hope that's right. This is one of those discussions that you can end up thinking that everybody's right. And I think that illustrates a point which first occurred to me when in hearing the story of, as recounted, of Yakovlevna. She, in fact, had to become part of Sistema in order to achieve her ends. And it is the sheer shapelessness of Russia, I think, which makes it so hard for most people outside the country or inside the country to see the country's future in anything other than rather apocalyptic terms. And it's very hard to prepare for the apocalypse. It's very hard for politicians to come up with clear rules when you don't actually know which money is corrupt. You've no means of telling how they got it. To cut it all off would possibly mean it would go to Singapore, or maybe Singapore would know. I don't know. I don't think so. It's a shapelessness which is very difficult to follow. So my question would be, well, it's difficult to frame it shortly, but one can sense that something new is going to come out of Russia, that the present system cannot last, that it's getting into increasing difficulty, but that nobody can now see how to restore the institutional framework, which is there, I think, in a nascent way at the end of the Yeltsin rule, which will be able to challenge change, channel change, and make it articulate. And until that happens, or people get a sense of it outside the country and within the country, all the prescriptions given are correct, but how to articulate them in a sense of priorities and an action plan, I think is fantastically difficult. So what is the solution?
Do you want to respond?
With my final solution. Well, there's a bunch of questions. One of the great mistakes, and it's a terrible mistake that gets made when people write about Russia, or it's just a cliche which leads to a mistake, is that Moscow is not Russia. Quite the opposite. Moscow is a little bit like LA is the quintessence of American dreams. That's kind of Moscow's relation to the rest of Russia. It's the place where anybody with ambition, anybody with a dream goes. The people, this was the most interesting thing that I met when I was looking at the people who are the volunteers for Navalny. Over half of them weren't Muscovites. Muscovites are kind of lazy. They've made a hell of a lot of money reselling their apartments, which they privatized in the 90s. They have a nice life. They know how to play the system. They sit in cafes moaning about it. They don't really do very much. Actually, it's quite the opposite. It's the people who are coming to Moscow, who have to rent apartments, try to build businesses, try to work in firms. They're the ones who are supporting Navalny, a huge amount of his support. So this idea that sort of there's educated Muscovites and yokels out there is absolute rubbish. They're, of course, the most sort of forward-thinking and energetic people from where they come from. But the idea that they're Muscovites is just completely false. They're all priezhие, and all of them are suffering because now there's a new law about propiski, which is incredibly complicated. So this illusion... Permits, about permits where you live, which is very, very complicated. A lot of them couldn't vote in Moscow, and they were still working for Navalny, because the permit system says you have to vote where you're registered, and most of them are still registered with their parents, and blah, 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 blah. So this idea that there's cultured Moscow and Siberian sticks is just completely wrong, and we have to start sort of looking beyond that cliche. Whether it's exporting an authoritarian model, I think it is literally. So very interesting to look at Ukraine. Shuvalov who's a higher-ranking Putin politician, went to Ukraine to help them reorganize their media in a way that kind of mirrored Russia, with its kind of fake debates and sort of a pseudo reality. I think the danger is if sort of the former Soviet states gets pulled into Russia's sort of sphere of influence by signing up to the customs union, they'll start taking on a lot of these habits. They spread. I don't think there's a sort of a Talmud that gets exported, but simply the talent starts going and starts passing these practices over. But again, this is actually part of a much larger kind of trend. Is Russia one of the leaders? Sometimes. I think in the 21st century, we've seen dictatorships reinvent themselves. Whether it's in Venezuela with Chavez, we've seen, or in China, or the one that I'm most fascinated with, which is Qatar, which is a country which appears to believe in a sort of like hard Islamic core, and yet uses everything from modern art to football to promote itself in the world. So we're seeing dictatorships learn new tricks. There's a very powerful metaphor that somebody once gave me. When Chechen terrorists took the Nordost theater in 2003, I think. I don't know if you remember this. The Moscow theater siege. 2000. My apologies. They came in, and I don't know if you remember. The Chechen terrorists held the theater hostage for several days. And the way the Russian special services they dealt with them, they threw in gas canisters, and they all choked, and they passed out. And the Russian special forces came in and burst the siege. When in Beslan, Chechen terrorists took the gym where the children were all studying. The first thing they did is they broke open the windows at the top. so they wouldn't fall for the same trick again. It's a very odd and very sort of maybe gruesome metaphor, but dictators have learned. They now know they have to knock out the windows at the top because they won't, so they can let sort of democratic elements sort of circulate. So they're getting cleverer, and they're getting cleverer everywhere.
We'll take one or two more, and then we'll end quite sharply at 6 o'clock. So last two questions, one right there and one over there. So. And then we'll let you two both sum up.
Maria Logan, Institute for Modern Russia. Talking about distorted reality and the role of the West, does it help when Russia gets accepted to major international clubs? You talked about OECD, which I believe is the last one that Russia has to conquer. And from what I know, Russia made it a goal, at least over the past decade, to get into as many clubs as they could for one purpose alone, which is to legitimize the regime. So do you think it helps when the West accepts Russian regime into these clubs, or it makes it more dangerous?
One other, and this will be the last questions. There was somebody who had a hand up in the back.
I'm Dina Newman. I work for BBC news programs, and I just remember something that Leonid Parfenov, who is a respected Russian journalist, he once said that this perhaps will help us to define this sort of concept of postmodern dictatorship. He said, in the times of the communists, most people, what they really wanted was to buy sausage without queuing and to go abroad. Very few people wanted freedom of speech or democratic rights. It's not something that they talked about on a daily basis. And guess what? When communism fell, that's exactly the two things that they got, was the sausage and the freedom to travel abroad, which is something that, people just, now you cannot take it away from them. Everything else is kind of, has to be negotiated further as we go along. I guess these days dictatorships just shape themselves, they're not rigidly defined as before.
So we're coming to an end, and would you like to answer those questions? Anything else you think of, follow up, and then maybe Pavel will have the last word.
Sure, we have to address the main question, or else I'll be accused of avoiding it, about what is the solution. Very important question about does one let Russia in, and there's sort of two positions. There's the, very simply, there's the Ed Lucas position, which is throw Russia out of all these institutions because they shouldn't be there, which is actually a morally and intellectually a position that makes sense. And then there's the other one, which is let's bring them in, and hopefully through some kind of osmosis they'll become fluffier. And I think both are probably wrong. The Ed Lucas one actually makes more kind of, at least it has some integrity to it, but it's not going to be very helpful. And when you talk to the Russian opposition, they're like, no, please keep us in the Council of Europe. At least it gives us the European Court of Human Rights. It gives us something to hit these buggers over the head with. So I think their one should be a little bit hypocritical. However, is there any way to sort of build more conditionality and to get the Kremlin to kind of eat its own words? Because it has signed up, in joining these institutions, it has signed up to all these anti-corruption, et cetera, vows. And we're always kind of very soft on it. We don't even talk about it. It sort of gets put right to the bottom of the agenda, or it's right at the top of the agenda at the G20, but it's meaningless. Is there any way to make that simulacrum, which is what it is at the moment, into some sort of reality? Is kind of the question. And that's what needs to start.
Can we hold them to the rules of the institutions they're in?
Exactly. It has to be made real. So about the what does one do with Russia? It's an age-old question, but listen. I think maybe the problem is actually these grand visions. There's a huge amount of difference between Systema of Stalin, Systema of Khrushchev. There's a huge amount of difference between the Systema of Gorbachev and the Systema of Yeltsin. They're all Systema. They're all shape-shifting, amorphous. You're quite right. You completely precisely said the difficulty with Russia, that you just disappear into this kind of like fog of inaccuracy. But there's still a huge amount of change between these different models. So what we'll probably get next, in an optimistic scenario, is Kudrin as prime minister, Prokhorov as president, whatever, the KGB still there. But hey, that's going to be a hell of a lot better than what we've got now. So yes, the problem is probably as endless as Russia, but that doesn't mean that one should kind of stop trying. Yeah.
On that note, do you want to sum up? Anything?
I actually wanted to start summing up by addressing the last comment about the things that people actually wanted right before Russia started transitioning to a new democratic state in the early 90s. And I think the real way for the country to advance today is by addressing the wants and needs of the Russian society head on. I mean, ultimately, we have to make peace with the fact that people don't think about the, high democratic values on a day-to-day basis. That's really not top of mind. What's top of mind today, what people really want, is they want to be able to function in their own country without resorting to bribery, without resorting to living to other countries to start their businesses. And they want to have a better place to live. Ultimately, the government, through corruption, through the sort of flushing out of professional people out of the government due to their ethical standards and lack of ultimate loyalty, the government has started to dissolve its institutions that are actually serving people. We've had floods and fires, and the emergency response is not there, and that's what people are really noticing. They're noticing that the government is failing them on these and addressing these very, very basic needs. So I think the way for the country as a whole to progress and for people outside of Russia to actually start helping this process is by bringing up attention to the fact what can be done on a day-to-day basis, combating corruption and restoring institutions. And that's how I think we will make progress. I wanted to thank Peter for his work on the paper, and it's a wonderful summary, and it's you made it very accessible for people that want to learn about what's going on in modern-day Russia and want to have a clear evidence of the sort of challenges.
Yeah. Yes, and that's it. Thank you very much. That's the paper. It's available downstairs, and it's also on our website. So thanks to both of you.
Thank you.